few things to discuss this afternoon, and, Mr. Leahy, if you can go forward.
Well, Mayor, members of council, the next 30 or 40 minutes has been set aside for discussing the budget. There was an indication by some council members they wanted to discuss the budget in advance of our we're just getting started preparing our budgets. So there was an indication that wanted to have some discussion. David Bradley has a very short presentation. If you're interested, it is material that he has shared with the department directors, kind of giving a little bit idea of what the revenue situation is looking like and what the base budget situation is looking like. So if that's your pleasure, we would do that.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you very much, Mr. Leahy.
So we kicked off the budget process on Friday, and earlier in that week we also had a briefing for the directors. So this is just a very high-level brief of where we're at this point in the process. So basically at this point in the process, our Department of Budget and Management Services projects revenue, and these are the non-department specific revenue. So we're not projecting what Human Services is going to get from the state and federal government or VDOT reimbursement revenue. This is real estate tax, personal property, and sales. So when we did that, we estimate that general fund revenue will grow about 2.4%. I don't, what we will do is we will check this again in January because we'll have 2 quarters posted, and we'll take another look. The biggest driver of this by far is real estate and the assessment growth. So we get a very preliminary estimate from the real estate assessor, and he's expecting it to grow about 3.1%. So he will refine that further as he goes through the next 2 quarters as well. That's the biggest variable that's really out there. The other revenues, we feel pretty comfortable, but we will monitor them to see if there's any major change that's occurred. So just for planning purposes, we started with generally where council has been a 2% pay increase. So we kind of set that aside. We make it very clear to departments that's not final. This is just planning purposes. It was 3% this past year. We got some things that from last budget year, or the one we're in now, actually, when you adopted the budget in May, things that we're just cognizant of that we got to be aware of. So we got the workforce development program that council approved at reconciliation. There's some additional costs for that, about $500,000 a year. You got the 4-year phase-in for the sheriff pay parity. Burton Station, there were actually some firefighters and paramedics that were added in this year's budget. Then they were not starting on July 1st, so we have to annualize them. And then there's additional paramedics and firefighters that will come online when the facility opens, the Burton Station fire station, which we think will be during fiscal year 21. Some big things that are out there, at this stage of the process, there's just a lot of unknowns, and there's nothing unusual about that. So healthcare cost. Right now, we have in place healthcare costs for calendar year 20. So we do this on a calendar year basis. The employer portion of that was a 3% increase for calendar year 20. It was a 0 increase for employees. So there's a benefit executive committee between the city and schools that are looking at healthcare costs. I'm on that committee. The trends have been really good for a few years. We're starting to see some higher claim trends in the last few months. So we're going to take another bite of that apple in fall and see where we're at. So that will only affect 6 months of fiscal year 21, though, because we're looking at calendar year 21. VRS, that's a big unknown at this point. That information will probably be coming out in November. Every 2 years, the state looks at our Virginia Retirement System rate, VRS. We're anticipating that it's going to go up. They have talked about changing what they think the return is on their investments. It's usually, they've assumed 7%. They're now looking at maybe 6.75 or 6.5. I believe they're meeting this week, if I heard that correctly. So that's a big unknown at this point. Once we get that information, for planning purposes, we just assumed it would go up 1%. Then we got some of the issues from the May 31st tragedy. We are looking at moving some people to leased property. We estimate that cost at $775,000 a year. But in addition, the general fund, and you're not seeing it here because it's on the revenue side, the general fund is losing approximately $500,000 a year because the water and sewer fund is an enterprise fund and they have to pay rent to the general fund for occupying building 2. Excuse me. So they'll have to pay rent to the private sector. So it's not an increase of cost to them, but it is a loss of revenue to the general fund. The biggest thing out there is the renovation of building 1, 2, and 3. So, I just, want to remind council, when we put the 6-year CIP together, I'm looking at being able to fund all 6 years. I mean, we're looking that we can pay the debt, the pay-go. So we always look at funding in a 6-year increment and the ability to do that. So this will be a new thing. That's not in the 6-year program. I wrote here, it says that there's no money in the current 6-year CIP. There was actually $800,000 in year 1, which we used for the bridging documents, the $4 million, if you remember. And there was $2 million in year 2. But generally, this is going to be unmet costs. And then we got funding the Strong Center. We're trying to leverage grants as much as possible for that. So these are what we call targets, and this is kind of getting into the way we do budgeting. But what we do is we establish targets and say, okay, if this is the amount of revenue we have, that 2.4%, and we think expenditures are growing at such rate, well, we can't give you 100%. We project right now there's about a $10 million deficit in the general fund with all these unknowns in there. So what we recommended was, let me see, get to that, 98% for all departments. So that's what departments are working on right now, and that means that they would have to make 2% cuts to balance their budget. And, it sounds like 2% is not a lot, but you will be getting into positions when you're talking about 2%. Last year we did 99%. We were able to do some trimming around, like some operating accounts. So that's kind of, and we've told departments, plan, pick your highest priorities because you may not get that 2% as we move forward. So that's where we are, and just some of the key dates that we have internally. We'll be reviewing CIP submissions in November, budget submissions at the end of November. We have a CIP caucus where the city manager, deputy city managers, and all the departments that are impacted by the CIP, we go through every project, literally almost a whole day session. It's real informative because you can see some of the cross relationships between projects. Right now, the budget's scheduled to be proposed on March 24th with adoption in May.
Okay, Mr. Wood?
So if you go back to that schedule, nope, there you go. So we should know by the time the budget is presented whether or not the state is going to come forward with the 20 million or whatever for building 2. So that could adjust your CIP.
And that's a good point. So what Mr. Wood is bringing up, right now we think that, we've put in for a $20 million interest-free loan and maybe a $10 million grant. So I think they're going to be addressing that in November, if I understand correctly. So that's a possibility. You also have public utilities, which is one of the departments that are impacted. They have their own revenue stream, so we have to look at that. Do they sell revenue bonds, and we apportion out part of a building? Do we sell general obligation bonds and they lease it from us as they do now? So there's some of those things we've got to work out.
79 million, though, that you have allocated to do buildings 1, 2, and 11, that you're not talking about revenue at that point. You're just saying this is the expense regardless of what the revenue source is. So it could be 10 million off,
Yes, and we got to take into account what the state will give, what the water and sewer fund can provide. So you're exactly right. There's a,
79 million is the cost.
it is the cost.
And it's like,
How do you
it's
fund it
paid,
from
it's
that?
paid for, okay.
And that's the number that, if you recall, on July 2nd, Tom Nicholas provided to you when he was going over this, and we've talked to him recently, and he still feels like 79 million is his best number at this point for the three buildings. And remember, it's really 83 million, because 4 million has already been approved for the design bridging documents.
Okay, John?
When you said the general, I'll go back and you said 10 million short, I forget which slide that was. It was.
I was talking through, so at 98%,
Is debt service for the CIP part of that $10 million shortfall?
it's a great question. So the way we do it is we have 100% things you have to fund. Elderly tax relief, debt service. So those come off the first top. So those are things that there's no choice to fund unless council makes a different policy change like on elderly tax relief and things like that. The school funding formula is in that number. We would use the same number right now, whether we use the SOQ or the one that's proposed, because if the SOQ grows at the same amount as our general fund revenue grew 2.4%, they're going to get roughly the same amount either way.
So getting back to then, so the $10 million shortfall is against all non-mandatory expenses?
That's the way we do
Okay,
it.
I just want to make
Yep.
sure I knew what
Yeah.
the base was.
Yeah, we're not assuming that you can cut debt or anything like that.
I know, I just want to make sure.
No, it's fair
When you
question.
said this is this, what the,
Yeah.
and when you get back talking about the CIP, will you be looking at excursions as to what other CIP projects could be deferred or pushed outside the fit up in order to balance to pull these higher needs forward? There'll be options that we'll see?
We go through that process every year, and the former city manager liked to do that on Saturdays, and we'll do whatever works to we go through every CIP project and look at need.
Coming back to the health thing, when you said employer cost, well, I guess there'll be a discussion and some discussion that comes back to us, because I know that last calendar year, we didn't pass any premium increase to the employees, and the taxpayers absorbed all that. But that will be a policy discussion that will come back to us if that's where we.
It
go.
absolutely
I-
can,
I'm just trying
absolutely.
To make sure, because I do know healthcare costs have risen, this experience rate are up across the nation.
And it's interesting, you know, we had a really good 3 or 4 year period where our balance in that fund has actually grown. And I think the challenge of that fund, you know, like I say, being a member of it, is we know it's going to increase. You know, everything you're saying, Mr. Moss, is out there. So how do we use the fund balance, you know, which is what we're trying to do to mitigate both employer and employee increases, so it's more like this instead of, you know, like that. And that's been the challenge of the committee, and that's why we're waiting for another quarter of claims.
We haven't revisited this in a while, but it'd be interesting to see again and talk to Chesapeake of what's been the savings of having their
Pharmacy.
corporate pharmacy. You know, because that's where some of the biggest growth has been in pharmaceutical costs. So it's probably not a bad idea to relook at that business case, and does that have merit? Is there some bilateral relationship we could have with them or something to, has that really been beneficial to them? There ought to be some business case by now, but in light of pharmacy costs, we probably ought to take another.
We have discussed it at the BEC, and we certainly can dive into that again.
And just from a point of view of trying to preserve our debt capacity, I know revenue bonds still count as debt, but we need to make sure that when we look at the business case between the types of debt, that general obligation debt that we can issue under the charter is a scarce resource. So if we can maximize that resource to have it on the table when we're talking to schools or ourselves, that might be an argument, even though I know revenue bonds go at a slightly higher rate, maybe 15 to 25 more basis points, but still that adds up over millions, I understand that. But that ought to be a consideration when we look at the mix as to what other needs we have for charter debt.
Good point. Okay, and, yeah, Barbara?
This was touched on in the earlier meeting about the Sandbridge TIF and the SSD. Are y'all in the process of reviewing those two?
Yes, ma'am.
Because it's so confusing to everybody.
We had, one of the analysts is looking at that, and I think the question is, does the TIF part of that need to stay? We're only using, I think the TIF gets about, what, $12 million a year, and we're declaring 8 or 9 million of it surplus. So, and I think you mentioned this at the meeting, if you're assuming every 3 years, sand replenishment, then you probably do, but that's not what's been occurring. It's been more about what, every 5 or so. And I think if we assume that is the reality, I think it's a possibility that the TIF could go away. So then at that point, the decision becomes, you got $3 or $4 million more that's been going to Sandbridge. We've been splitting that $4 million between the 2 CIPs. Do you bring that whole 12 million back into the funding formula, or, you know, so we're going to have to look at that if we think the TIF can be eliminated.
Well, the way you've been doing it by declaring it surplus, then it has gone to the CIPs instead of to the general fund.
That's good.
But if we were to just have it as just regular tax money, it would all go to general fund. So then the CIPs would not get that specific designation.
That's correct.
Since it's surplus, so the money would go into a different place. I mean, I want to make certain that we don't do anything to threaten that sand project in the
Absolutely.
future. But I know when we originally did it, there were a lot of things that have changed since the time that we started of course, the big thing that's changed is that except for this year, we did get a little bit of federal money, but by and large, it's been local money.
That's
instead of
correct.
the 65-35 split that it was supposed to be. But, you know, with all these years of experience, but I think we also need to, you know, to answer these questions that keep coming up, because the folks just have a tendency to think that the TIF is also Sandbridge's special money, but that's just their regular tax money, which would be there, but instead it would all go to the general fund instead of going through this process of being declared surplus.
And that's why we shared it with the schools. When we knew that we had more money than we thought we needed in the TIF, we felt like when we were talking to the city attorney's office many, many years ago, that this declaration of surplus, which is something you can do by what the state empowers you, was the best way to do it. And since the TIF would have gone through the funding formula, you know, we felt like it was only fair to share that surplus between the two. So we're trying to be consistent with council's policy on the funding formula when we did that.
John, okay, John?
We got TIFs, since we have one at Town Center, I hope that we're applying the same philosophy. If there's excess funds over and above what they need, that before we start looking at raising taxes and fees on people, that we're harvesting from that account as well. And because that's all, and I don't know if we're re-looking at, but I know this has been talked about, and maybe it's not a council desire as a whole, but there's been a discussion about re-looking at the tip fund algorithm. 100% of the amusement tax goes into the tip fund. There's no way tourists pay 100%. I go to a lot of movies, play golf, do a lot of things, so do other residents. So tourists are not paying 100% of the amusement tax. So I think that needs to be looked at. Also, I remember a discussion, even though I don't support the stormwater management fee itself, there was a discussion that there was some study group that was gonna come back to the council and have some better algorithm allocation of cost to make it less regressive than it is. I hope we were told we would get a chance to see that and comment on it before it came back. So I don't know if that's on the calendar.
It is happening as you speak, and I saw the first briefing on it last week. I think it needs, you know, a little more work. The MLT will be reviewing that this week, so that is in process and being worked on.
I just want to make sure that the discussion was that first, we would have a chance to look at it and
Absolutely.
comment and feedback before it became something that was in the budget recommendation itself.
I actually, oh, good.
Absolutely.
All right, just making sure I remembered it.
No, I think that's a good idea. Barbara?
Safe bet there.
Since we're going to be, now that the schedule was pushed back some, we're not going to be getting the results of the funding studies until January, February in the recommendation or the actual adoption phase. Is that time enough to be able to cycle in some of their recommendations into the budget? Or, I mean, it seems like that's
Funding
cutting
studies
pretty close.
for-
If there's funding for flooding or sea level rise that we need to begin because of their recommendations, is there?
That was going to be revenue neutral. They were looking at different ways to distribute the stormwater fee, but not, there wasn't going to be an attempt to raise the amount generated from the fee with the changes. So you
That's
jump in
good.
here
Yeah,
anytime.
I was thinking she was talking about
something
something else. I'm sorry.
So they'll be still planning on the same amount of stormwater revenue that they would get if you made no changes.
So it's all within that money, we're not thinking in terms of, we've always kind of said it's going to take more than stormwater fee money if we're going to deal with sea level rise, and we've always kind of
No,
contemplated that it would take some additional CIP money straight from that. So we're not anticipating that we'll be trying to introduce any of those kinds of projects or anything in this CIP, because we won't know
Well-
in time to know that they will be required.
in the last budget year, you actually authorized a series of stormwater increases for the next
Yes.
5 years?
5 years after
But
this
that's
one.
a
5
stormwater
years
fee.
in the stormwater fee, and then you dedicated a certain amount of the real estate tax. We laid out a capital funding program that fits within those revenue limits.
We identified the projects, though,
Yes.
so that then we would be locked into those projects that we would have known before we did all of this study. We wouldn't be having the benefit of any of the new information that we're getting from the study.
And you're not really locked in, because that was a 15-year plan, and the actual CIP you adopt is a 6-year plan. So you could change it every single year, but we do present a plan, both a 6-year and a 15-year plan that fits within that funding stream that you set. But they can be adjusted in every single year.
And Mrs. Henley, city managers also asked us to look at a series of stormwater briefings that I think I just sent today. So in November, there'll be more information about where we're at on a lot of issues associated with stormwater, including this ERU rate issue that we're talking about. And, we're hoping to have that all provided to council by January, ahead of your retreat.
Okay, John?
I still say the fee's the wrong way to go. It's a regressive fee, and I'm waiting to see how you make it more progressive. But anyway, it is a regressive fee. But I think we need to come back to two things. One would be next time we meet, but I do think we need to be talking about this bond referendum, and there ought to make sure that you're planning. I mean, I hope we can get support for that. Public's gonna have to decide if they want to accelerate or they want to live with a 15-year plan. I think that's not acceptable personally when I talk to people. But the last budget deferred for 3 years, addressing the backlog in ditch and canal maintenance. I don't know how any of us can sit around this table and see what's happening and say that there has to be lower priority things in the general fund and the CIP than, I'm not saying do it in 1 year, but waiting 2 more years to even get started cannot be where we are at as a body. Just cannot be. So give us some options. There might be some I don't like. I'm sure there will be, but nonetheless, we got to come to some consensus as to how we're going to move on that a little quicker than we are. I don't know, maybe revenues will come in more than what we hope. That would be nice. But I do think that we've got to make some movement on that backlog before the FY23 budget. I really do think we have to figure out how to get there. And if we say we can't get there anyway, when I'd rather prefer to raise a tax and raise a fee. That's my own personal belief. I understand the attractiveness of the fee because we have a lot of exempt property. Some of that's our own decision that we've made that's caused that to happen. Others, it's the state law that gives exempt property and the constitutional amendment and other programs that reduces our tax base, and those people have to pay the fee. So maybe if we can better understand that and the narrative of what that cost gets transferred to everybody else who's paying the tax. I understand that. So if we can understand the business case for both, I think we just want to understand the options, because when you engage the public, they're going to ask, well, why this, why that? But I do believe, and I don't think it's fading, I see these other cities that are getting hit by these big floods, and certainly Plaza's not totally fixed, but the work that we have done has made a material difference where we've made it. And so I think people in the southern part of the city or where they're at, ditches, shadow on whatever, that's something I think we ought to try to figure out. Give us some options and let us take the heat for whatever we have to raise to make it fix. But people deserve to not from having their places flood because it rains. Now, sea level rise and hurricanes is another story, but heavy rains, their streets and their homes shouldn't be flooding. I think we need to try to fix that sooner if we can.
Okay, Barbara?
Just because John keeps bringing it up, but a possibility of a referendum. Doesn't that raise a lot of questions that we would need to address, such as what our debt ceiling metrics and so forth are and so forth? I mean, don't we need to be talking about all of that?
I have consistently, as the mayor can attest, been trying to get this on the agenda. I've written you all 2 letters to that effect. Next meeting, we're supposed to have that discussion. I've also said we haven't been doing the staff work, and we're running out the clock on the option, in my opinion. But I totally agree with you, and I think that because we're looking at $56 billion in real estate we're trying to protect, I think when our discussions, when we talk to the bond people, they're gonna look at where we're spending all our money. But also, I think we're also talking about trying to protect, not diminishing or destroying our tax base. But I don't disagree with you on any of those things. I think we need to accelerate those discussions, and we are late to that discussion. I would agree with you on that, too.
But then the other thing is we really don't have all of the potential projects in yet. And we don't want to commit to things because, I mean, for example, the whole southern part of the city study is not in that. And I certainly don't want us to commit to spending all the money in the, and leaving the whole southern part of the city out of the formula here. So
There's a
until
lot-
we have all of the data in, how do we do it?
Well, I had this discussion with Dave, because remember when I had this, Dave said, yes, we have a list of projects. He said that he could bring that forth. I remember him saying that. I said, well, great, how soon can you bring that forward? And another thing you gotta look about is giving the low rate cost of money, which is 10-year treasury notes are 1.532%. We can probably borrow at 1.7. It may be a better strategy to pay off all the debt in 10 years and be able to reissue those and be able to spend $800 million over 20 years versus only $400 million, only because of the most favorable rates in terms of the borrowing. I think there's lots of discussions that we need, Barbara. I don't disagree with you. I think we should have been having them about a month ago, and I tried to have them then, but getting time on the agenda has been difficult. But I think this is an important issue for the public, and I think it's, we gotta ask them, if they wanna take the risk over 15 years, I'm happy with that answer, because it's their answer. I just think we owe them the right to choose if they want to choose it faster. This is, the only way you're gonna do that is principally by borrowing, and it's gonna come at a cost of tax. But would you rather pay $3,000 a year for flood insurance, or would you rather pay $200 or $300 more a year for taxes? And I think that's the narrative, but you're right. Maybe we have to put a place marker in. I don't know the answer, but I think we have to build you call it, the full, everybody, all the kids have to be at the table, as Myra used to say, right? All 7 kids at the districts all have to be at the table, but I think it's a doable thing, and I think it would be better received than we might think. But if they say no, there's nothing wrong with them saying no if they don't want to pay, but then they just they'll just take the 15-year plan, and they've accepted the risk that comes with it, and that's what voters get to do. They get to decide the risk they want to accept. But I think I'm not saying it's gonna be in the budget, I'm just saying the budget needs to account, and that's a time to be having the discussion. But I agree, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think it's doable.
Okay, Guy?
I generally agree with Mr. Moss. I'd like to ask the question from a staffing standpoint. Do we have the staff available to give us all the information we need, or do we need outside help in making that decision? And if so, do we need to be thinking about who we need, when we need them? We're going to have them here. We're going to have special meetings. I'm just raising those issues.
I would defer to the person who.
So at this present time, Public Works is down some 25 to 29 engineers. I think it's 25 engineers out of a contingent of 69 engineers. Public Utilities is similarly impacted. It's the result of massive retirements of baby boomers who rolled into this place in the 70s and 80s. It is the result of the labor market, which is brutal. It's also the direct tragic results of the May event, because many of the injured and killed were engineers. So we're having, to some extent, all of our projects are being delayed right now, and one of our biggest critical paths is competent project managers to manage the projects. You can assign more projects to the engineers, and then they're going to make more mistakes, or they're going to not be around or not taking care of the things, and next thing you know, either a consulting engineer or the contractor is taken advantage of us or made a big mistake. We do have two world-class consultants reporting to us right now, Dewberry on the seawater and the storm surge flooding aspect, and can't, just pulled a blank on the other one, the one that's doing our stormwater, CDM Smith. CDM Smith, which is doing the infrastructure stormwater side. So we can engage them, we could use those resources. That comes at a price. Our in-house project management is done at a much, much lower cost than when you go out and procure that project management from the private sector.
Yeah, but time, time is a value.
Yes, sir.
And when you look at the financing forecast, there's a window because of this global trade slump that's now causing a global economy to contract, and now has provided this tremendous surplus of capital looking for returns, which is why the low treasury notes. There is a window of opportunity that won't last forever. It's probably somewhere around late 22, they're saying 23 timeframe. They expect this contraction. So you gotta think about time. It's like, and you manage, and there's a lot of big firms that do big projects, and I've talked a lot about the acquisition strategy for $400 million. Should be a different acquisition strategy. Do you go out and say, I'm gonna go out and do an RFP for a 10-year, $400 million program, and you hire an A&E firm to do start to finish and be bonded for the performance of the results at the end? That's a strategy. Costs more, but at the end, they're bonded for their results, and you can move things at a faster pace because you don't pay all these mobilization, demobilization, labor stability. That's a factor. But I just think that's why there's a lot of discussion about this. It's not just the projects themselves, but it's the acquisition strategy and the financial strategy, which are fundamental.
That has to be the other side.
Fundamental piece, and there are people in big business with Bechtel, Burns McDonnell, there's a lot of international big firms that do these large-scale projects, like the $2 billion project in New York City for a seawall. They're out there, and I think that's the kind of, if you're talking this size of money, this time frame, you really do need people who know the capital markets, buy the quantity. It's just bigger than building a local school for $20 million. So I do think acquisition strategy is part of that process, but I can't judge all your issues. If they're issues because we're not paying market rates, you need to come and tell us that. That's something we need to fix. But I would suggest, even if that were not the case, you might want to put something as big as this with people who have experience dealing with these size of projects and have had to implement them over a short period of time. I don't know if you had watched the show where the French firm that built the coverage for Chernobyl, right? That was a $7.5 billion internationally funded project. They had to do that thing on a very tight timeline of 7 years in a radiation environment. So I do think there's a specialty skill set that people have who are used to doing big projects on a compressed timeline. And I do think we need to make sure that maybe there's a better way of doing it than with organic resources.
If I may, so I do need to separate the difference between the stormwater infrastructure work that's protecting neighborhoods and the sea level rise, big type projects that would protect the entire city. What we are funding now and working on now is the former, the neighborhood type projects, and they aren't big projects, they are lots and lots of little projects.
But if you did all at Princess Anne Plaza in a 3-year period of time, that's $392 million, that would be a big project.
Well, yes, sir, but it is not one big project. It's a lot of things all over the entire area, so they end up breaking down into small component parts.
But it could be done as a holistic contract award.
Except when we get into the neighborhoods and you start talking about digging up neighborhoods, we can only keep 1,000 feet at a time open because, and I know a lot about this because we've done it for years in utilities as we were ripping up neighborhoods to replace sewer lines. You have to move through the neighborhoods in 1,000-foot sections. You can't just bring as many contractors in as you fit in the area because then nobody can get in and out of the neighborhoods. It can be quite, it's not the same as building one huge, large project.
I think you underestimate the creativity of the private sector.
Yes, sir. for the time that we've allotted for the Bow Creek project to convert that to a lake and recreational area was aimed more at what we thought the neighborhoods could tolerate in terms of truck traffic hauling dirt through the streets. So there are other things. There's also the design and the permitting stage and the property acquisition stage. You had asked earlier about how long it takes to, that we try to negotiate before we finally, say, take a quick take certificate on a property. Most of the time, actually, before we can actually sit down and negotiate for a easement or a piece of parcel, we first have to design the project and then create the plats. And then there's a state mandated process that we go through in acquiring the property, attempting voluntarily. And when that has not worked, then we come to you and you give us permission to use eminent domain. So many times, there can be years and years and years in that between the design and the negotiation period before we get to that quick take.
All I know is we take too long, and I believe it can be done faster than we do it.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Jim, did you have, anybody? Rosemary?
I'm just gonna throw something out. I'm wondering if it would be worthwhile to do some type of polling to see what the appetite for the public might be for the referendum. And I don't know if it's a worthy suggestion or not, but we might, if we're gonna have this gigantic effort and push, we might kind of want to test what's out there.
We just sent you a piece of information about the citizen satisfaction survey. Maybe we can add a question or two
We could add that
there.
on there and get some kind of an
Okay.
idea. Polling anyway with the survey.
Yep, I think it's critical. I think people really need to realize what the future of flood insurance rates are that are coming, as they are now going to have to be actuarially sound and the federal subsidy disappears. You know, that is a real threat to our real estate tax assessments, is those insurance rates. And I'm just thinking, I'm just trying to be proactive and looking out ahead of that, because those next set of FEMA maps and that next set of flood insurance rates is not gonna be a pretty picture, and it's gonna impact the pocketbook of many people who just don't track those kind of things going on. And changing them by investments, changing those flood maps will yield direct benefits to property owners, and I'd rather pay taxes for something I got than pay insurance for a flood I'm going to get. And I think but I understand what you're saying, Rosemary, I don't disagree, but it's a lot of education that needs to take place, and Barbara has always talked about that.
But at least we'd have a feeling of at least of
Right.
a starting point of where if we want to move forward, of where we're starting to get to where we want to go to get the information out.
I agree with you.
Okay, anybody else? If I can make a suggestion, I thought this conversation was helpful. And, I certainly don't want to usurp on, staff, but do you think bringing it out to the council and staff, that periodic briefings like this along the budget process, that when things do come up that it might be better to get some council direction? Good example, I would like to see an acceleration on the maintenance backlog, myself. And the other thing is, too, I think, Tom, you bring up a very valuable point that we're short in engineers that are really detrimental. If we could set that as a council priority and an ongoing basis going into the budget, and have, give direction for that, or any of the number of things that staff does come up with along the line that, might be an outlier for some reason. And this way, also, the council feels like they're more proactive and given, some direction along the line. Because personally, I like to see that when we do get to the budget vote, that, we're all on the same page. Maybe not 100%, but in the same way. But maybe the periodic briefings, discussions, and staff coming to us for, what do you think about this? Because I think, the engineering shortfall could be a crisis situation. And if we give you a direction that, okay, in the budget, make remedies for it, I think that might be helpful. That's just my thought.
I'd like to make them soon.
Okay? Would that be a good direction? Okay, thank you. Tell you what, great briefing, folks. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, guys. So next, we have the Office of Emergency Management. Kim Tempesco is going to brief us on both the great success we've had with a revamped residential elevation project, and then some new area we're trying to get into, which is applying for some grants for some acquiring homes that we would then clear the property and they would become open space. Kim?
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, council members, and Mr. Leahy. I wanted to thank you for having us here to present today. We're here to talk to you about the flood mitigation grant projects that are currently going on, as well as our proposals for some future grant obligations. I believe you're all familiar with the history of this program, so I don't want to go back through the last 9 years, but I did want to review a few of the key reasons that we've now been able to be successful. After much heartache with VDEM and FEMA back and forth trying to make these projects work, we finally had to notify VDEM that we couldn't move forward with these projects with the way they were laid out with the restrictiveness of the budgets and things, and the projects coming way back over bid. So we notified them that we were not able to continue. A few months later, we ended up receiving a memo of determination from FEMA Region 3 that there wasn't a prohibition of allowing homeowners to contract directly with the contractors, and so we started working on our pilot program. Through this program, we worked with purchasing, legal, public works, housing, and many other departments to ensure compliance. This slide just kind of lays out some of the high points that contributed to the success, mainly the homeowner contracting directly with the contractor and not involving the city. We now had 12 contractors and 5 engineering firms instead of the 1 or 2 that were bidding. Greatly reduced city staff involvement and city liability. And the homes were being completed much, much quicker, and an estimated cost savings of about 35 to 45%. This is an example of the cost savings. These 4 houses we actually had put out to bid as a city project. We put them out to bid twice and then also did some value engineering on them. And when the homeowner put them out to bid, these were the reductions we were seeing immediately. The first one being a bid of $339,000 reduced down to $293,000, but then when the homeowner bid it, the project was able to be completed for $185,000. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. These are just an example of the homes that we have in progress right now. These 2 are actually completed. I wanted to draw your attention to the flood insurance rate reduction on the Tanninger property. That's $10,200 a year down to $540. That is directly in that citizen's pocket and back in his wallet, and a savings to him. These, the first home is actually on Northgate Court. That's the only one, or the one on the bottom rather. That's the only one we have in Princess Anne Plaza right now. The other 3, 2 on Lynn Drive and 29th Street, those are all due to be completed within the month. The Northgate one's actually due to be completed on the 24th. These properties are about 60 days out. The Canal homes are due to be completed by the end of November, and the Wake Forest by mid-December. And these are the remaining houses that we have on our 2016 grant. As you can see, all but one of them is currently under in some sort of progress status. This is a very big deal to us because we have this grant was awarded less than 2 years ago, and it'll be the first time that we have not had to request an extension or additional funds or drop homes in order to complete the process. Now to the future programs. With the success of our pilot program, we're looking to continue with our commitment. The slideshow shows the minimum requirements for the grant program, mainly an SRL or an RL property. SRL is 4 or more flood claims, $5,000 or greater, and an RL is 2 or more flood claims of only $1,000 or greater. The RL homes are paid at 90% and the SRL at 100%. They have to be insured by the NFIP, and they have to be cost beneficial to mitigate. There's a couple of ways to do that. The predetermined benefits is the easiest to go with. Unfortunately, the elevation limit is 175, and through our grant application so far, we've seen that that's just not feasible in Virginia Beach. The 276 is for acquisition, and while that wasn't something that we could have even entertained, nor did the city necessarily want to go that direction down on the Shore Drive corridor, in some of the other neighborhoods that might be possible. And then by BCA calculation, and there's two different methods for that, the flood module, which requires an elevation certificate, and then the damage frequency assessment, which requires either historical or anticipated claims. The problem with the damage frequency assessment is that it extends the damage claims of that property over the life of the property. So even though we've had homes that have been damaged 4, 5, 6 times in the last 10 years, if that house was built in prior to 1978, we can use the 1978 date, but that's still assuming, the NFIP assumes in the calculation that those damages are stretched over that whole 38-year period, so it determines that they're not cost beneficial using that method. Once we have reviewed the list, we kind of start narrowing it down. Our general method has been, we start with the smaller homes, about 2,000 square feet, and look for about $75,000 in flood claims, and then make sure that they are insured. That generally, if we can get about 15 properties, we start running the analysis on that. If we get less than that, then we will kind of expand a little bit, and we'll go with homes that might be a little bit bigger or have a little bit lower flood claims. But we've seen if we go much bigger or much fewer in flood claims, they tend to not qualify. Our next step after we do that is we will take our list of properties and talk with mainly Public Works and make sure that there's no interference with any of their stormwater projects, particularly now that we're seeing some of the houses in Windsor Woods and Princess Anne Plaza show up on the list. And then we'll run the benefit on that. If it looks like we can get them to qualify, we then will send letters of interest to the owners, because another one of these requirements is that it has to be a voluntary program. We can't just decide that we're going to elevate these folks' houses or acquire them or whatnot and without their input. And believe it or not, we've actually had people that have said no. So the different actions that can be completed under the flood mitigation assistance grants, we have the elevation, acquisition, and mitigation reconstruction. All of them have some of the advantages, but the elevation so far has been the city's primary method for mitigation, because the homes that we were initially looking at were down in Lynn Haven Colony and Broad Bay Estate, so it's been the position that we didn't necessarily want to acquire properties down there, because there is now the requirement that they stay green space forever. Mitigation reconstruction is actually a very attractive option. That would be the best way to go in our opinion. That would result in a home being completely code compliant, brand new home, reduced flood rates, and an increased value for the new home. The problem with that is that the funding is capped at $150,000 for that. So the owner would have to pay the balance. And the new structure also has to be within 10% of the existing square footage. So a lot of these homes that might be interested would want to build a bigger house, and that's not possible under this program. The other challenge is that, and I've asked FEMA this several times, most of the homes that are being mitigation reconstruction around the country are homes that are outright owned and don't have a mortgage on them. I've inquired with a couple of FEMA folks as well as some mortgage companies, and they don't really have an answer as to how that would be handled if there's a loan on the property. Some banks kind of looked at me like, what do you mean you want to knock a house down that I've got interest in? So that would be a hurdle if we chose to look at that option, and it also would mean that if a homeowner was interested, they would probably have to have a minimum of $50,000 to $100,000 to chip in on that. When we talk about which action is best, once we've identified the project or the properties, if the owners want to be included, then we then look at which action. As mentioned earlier, elevation has been our primary method in the Shore Drive corridor, but with the recent flooding in Windsor Woods and Princess Anne Plaza, we were starting to look at possible acquisitions where it made sense. And also, there's been a few down in the southern watershed that have inquired. I put this slide in here just to kind of give you an illustration of where our SRL properties are located. As you can see, we've got some neighborhoods that, and I did put some comments down there, the lakes, for example, and Rosemont Forest. Unfortunately, all of the SRL homes that are in those neighborhoods are all attached, and unless both homes qualify, we're not able to elevate half of a duplex. So those have kind of been taken off the table. There's 8 down in Sandbridge. They are V-zone and require deep helical piles, but there's actually been no recent flood events. Most are earlier than 2003, and most aren't primary residences, so that wouldn't be a priority for us to look at. And there are 4 down in southern watershed that we've potentially been looking at. The challenge we're running into down there is that the base flood elevation is 3 feet. And what we've been seeing when we run the benefit cost analysis on any homes is basically they need to be sitting at least 1 foot to 2 foot below base flood elevation to get a qualifying BCA. So if we get elevation certificates for those properties, we could run them and see what happens. We're just not real confident that with a BCA or a base flood elevation of 3 that we'd have many homes down there that would qualify. The main thing we wanted to talk to you all about today is the 2019 application that's now open. Our proposal would be to put an elevation grant in for the 2019 cycle, as well as for the first time an acquisition grant. The elevation grant would include the 4 homes that we did remove off of the 2013 and 2015 grant. And then we would look to identify probably 5 to 6 more. VDEM has a limit of 10 homes per grant, so we would look to see if we could identify 5 or 6 more to add to that application for a total of 10. And we would look at the neighborhoods that are the most flood prone: Windhaven Colony, the Southern Watershed, and Princess Anne Plaza and Windsor Woods. And then we would go through the same process that I just identified, look at the number of flood claims, the size and condition of the house, and then the benefit cost analysis of that particular house. For the application for acquisition, we had first actually discussed a possibility of this back in March when the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program opportunity came up. That was a result of declared disasters in Virginia, not ours, but of a couple of the flood events that did not affect us. However, the funding was still open for the entire state. There was a very tight timeline on that, and the challenge with that grant program is that it is a 75-25% cost share, so the city would have a 25% cost share had we chosen to apply for that round of grants. So we did kind of decide that we would hold it back for possibly the FMA grant application and give us a little more time and be able to work with Public Works a little more and possibly identify some more properties. So when we started looking at the Princess Anne Plaza and Windsor Woods properties, we noticed that there were 4 that were attached to a city park. Those immediately caught our attention because one of the strategies would be to incorporate the green space right into that existing park, and then we wouldn't be checkerboarding the neighborhood with empty lots that would then need to be maintained. We put together a list in that neighborhood. We came up with, I believe there were 19 properties on that list that we had Public Works take a look at. The 4 that were adjacent to the park, Public Works actually had no use for as part of their stormwater projects because they were in a location that wouldn't have been optimal for either pump stations or pipe. And additionally, they provided us the information that in all of the modeling they've done, those properties would all still flood even after every stormwater project is done in that neighborhood. So we then talked to Parks and Rec to see if they would be interested in possibly absorbing those properties into the park if we did pursue an acquisition application, and they were more than happy to expand their park. So We looked at those properties. We also, Public Works had identified 4 properties that were along Northgate Drive as potential locations for their stormwater pipes. They indicated that these lots would be prime locations for their pipe locations, and in fact, one of the lots was actually their desired location, but it would have required them to acquire the property, which they hadn't put that in their report at that time. But they were going to go around the property boundaries. But by the city acquiring that property as part of a grant program, we would be able to put pipe under the ground. We would not be able to put a pump station. Back in April, we did send 8 letters to those homeowners, the 4 in along the park and the 4 on Northgate. Of those, 2 were interested, 2 were not, and 4 did not respond. I should note that the 2 that were not, one actually was a home that the woman had been basically begging our office to buy her house for several years. And when I called her and said, good news, we finally are able to do this, she was had just sold her house and was closing that next week. So we now have a new homeowner in that house that was not quite aware of the flooding extent that property experienced. And the other house that was not, the house had been purchased after Matthew and was flipped. And at the time we sent the letter, it was owned by an LLC. It has been sold to a new homeowner now who, when she called me, she told me that she was told that the real estate agent and the former owner had informed them that there was lots of work done and that it would never flood again. So I think she did keep my information, and she was going to follow back up with me in the future if she felt like it. Before I move on to questions, I had one last thing I wanted to present to you all. As part of the CRS program, we are now required to provide an annual update to our hazard mitigation plan. A copy was provided in your packet on Friday. The requirements are that it is presented to the governing body and posted on the city website for review. Our full plan is required to be updated by March of 2022, and we are actually in the beginning stages of working with the region on that revision. Some of the key action items that are in that report as far as an update since our last revision: we have entered the CRS program, we have a continued participation in the NFIP, we have additional staff obtaining the CFM certification, and through the use of Waze and Rave, we've improved the alerting and warning notification systems related to flooding. And the couple that pertain directly to these projects, we are committed to elevating, relocating, and retrofitting SRL properties, with 10 to 12 being done by the end of 2019, the ones that I just showed you. And then also another item in there is acquiring open space in strategic locations. That is through some of agriculture's land acquisitions that they've done as some of their projects, and then should we choose to pursue acquisitions, then those would count towards that as well. That's all I have.
Any questions?
Questions?
Mr. Wood?
Thanks. So this is funded through VDIM.
It's FEMA, funded through FEMA through VDEM, yes, sir.
So FEMA would not let us do it this way, but they'll let the state do it this way? Is that kind of what and the reason I say this is it kind of goes back to conversations we had about this when we first started this, and as you can see, it's and Louis, it's absolutely insane, the pricing to
It is.
elevate a house and to do that, and unlike, we talk about the private sector and everything, unlike public works or public utilities projects where you only have government contractors engaged in that, house building is almost universally private sector contractors, and there are many dozens of them in Virginia Beach, much less in the region. And we talked about this, and we got the information that, well, our region treated us differently than other regions treat about how all this, because we have other places around the country talk about what a great success they have with this, and we're sitting here with these upside down numbers, something that should be $100,000 is $300,000, that sort of thing. But it is FEMA funded ultimately, but
It is.
the state is managing it, making sure that we manage it. So So I think that's good. You know, we talk about the action comparisons on there, and I was looking at that, and the, you know, we talk about, it's, whichever one is fine. The disadvantages to acquisition, you indicate that it has to remain open space. Now, is that a FEMA requirement or a VDEM requirement, or?
FEMA.
And even a pump station, because you say no pump stations on there, they, even though it's something that would be really good to
Yes.
do this. Now, when we did the BRAC acquisitions and APZ1, we talked about the importance, you talked about the checkerboarding, we called it Swiss cheesing back then of the neighborhood, but basically the same thing. And the way in the APZ1 that it worked through was, we were able to take a vacant lot between two properties and sell that to the adjoining properties. Is that permitted under this?
It
Or
is.
does it have to be government owned?
It is, and we've talked to, legal's been involved with every step of the way, and if we choose to pursue the acquisitions, we would model it after those acquisitions. And she did mention that they sold the properties to the two adjacent homeowners. We absolutely could do that. That piece of the parcel would just be deed restricted, and they would not be allowed to build on that, but it still could.
Just like APZ1, right, okay. So we could model it after that, so that's good to know. Because it does bother me that we can't use it for flood mitigation structures like a storm, like a pump
Yes.
station. If it's an underground pump station, does that count?
So we inquired of FEMA, and a pump station is considered a structure, and structures are prohibited. They did say that pipe under the ground there could be pipe under there, it just could not have a structure on it, so.
So it could be an underground pump station like we have
Yes,
down
sir.
the ocean front, okay. And then this reconstruction, you know, I can see why that, I mean, that just seems ridiculous when you're telling a homeowner they've got to pay an extra $50 to $60 a square foot over and above this. And by the way, you can't increase your footprint or your overall square footage enough to even add a bathroom or a bedroom or a larger kitchen after, if you're doing all this kind of work, everybody's gonna wanna modernize their home, so that's unfortunate, but this is good, I'm really glad to see this, thank
Lot
you.
better than it was.
Okay. Barbara? And then Jess.
Well, the map that we keep seeing with the Dewberry report, particularly in the southern part of the city, you know, has those blue dots where the property will flood, and we're talking about, in the southern part of the city, I think probably most of that would be acquisition rather than in these other neighborhoods in the north. Properties that are going to flood and elevating those is just not quite realistic. But these monies don't seem to be really available for that kind of thing. So if we were going to be doing a referendum, would we potentially be able to set aside a certain amount of money for that kind of thing, or particularly if we're making it open? But people are, you know, they wanting to know, well, should I, because they're not looking at getting any of this money, should I go ahead and spend the money on my house and try to elevate it, or what should I do? Because I really don't see an answer for those folks coming out of particularly this program, but are there others we're looking at, or other possibilities we're looking at? What do we tell folks?
So this program is just the strict grant program that's run through our office. We've been working very closely with Public Works and looking at other solutions that I know Council's been discussing as well. And so this was kind of a stepping stone for us to get into acquisitions with the grant funding and not require city funding. But you're right, the southern part of the city and other homes that don't qualify. I mean, I'm looking at my list of the southern end right now, and I have 5 homes, and only 5 homes that are SRL homes that would even need, be able to be considered for the grant program. So for the rest of those homes, then we would have to look at other options. And so that's kind of a bigger discussion that Public Works has been having for a long time, so. Sure.
I see this as just one of the tools in our toolbox. City Council directed the city manager to have staff look at developing a acquisition policy this year. We are doing that. But what I envision is that'll be complementary to this, and we will probably develop a program, sort of like we're doing with BRAC, which will start to address properties, I'll call, in the northern developed part of the city and also in the southern part of the city, because they're going to be a little bit different on how we need to go after those. So we're working on that right now, and hopefully we'll get it done this year.
Well, I know that our being able to get into the CRS program with the level that we did, I think I remember that we got a lot of the points from our open space program. And just the very fact that we had that program all those years, and a lot of the properties that we acquired were probably not developed because they were not suitable because of this kind of issue. It turns out to be one of those unintended benefits that, with that whole program. And I've been saying our open space program is out of money. It might be advantageous to look at that program and saying, could this be a program that we need to reactivate as a part of our stormwater plan for the city?
Yeah, I envision there's going to be some sort of program where it's going to be open space, floodplain restoration, which will cover those areas, particularly in the southern part of the city.
I see
All right,
acquisition
Jess, and then John.
renovation.
I had some questions about the projects that we had been working on, but I did, one of the things Jim said I was curious about. When we've acquired, we really acquired anything?
No,
Okay,
we
that's
have
what I
not.
wanted, then more of just a comment, because I do know if we decide to implement a process similar to what we did in the BRAC in terms of giving adjoining property holders an opportunity to buy it. I know some lenders, even if a sliver of the property is in a flood zone, they require the entire property to be insured as if the whole thing was in. So I think that would be, I'd be interested to know what our process would be to making sure that if we did sell a portion of that property or give a portion of that property to a homeowner, they understand what could
Those are all-
potentially happen.
Yeah, those are all the pieces that we'd like to put our big toe in the water to say, to look at acquisition, because those are all the pieces that we're gonna have to look at. If we've taken that property because it was flooded, then those are the pieces that we have to look at.
That was more just a comment, but on the properties that we have, can you tell me how many of them were on slabs? Versus
2 of them are on
the
slabs.
rest of them were already on a
The one on Northgate is on a slab, and the one actually on Tanninger Trail, which is done, is on a slab. A couple of others had one room that was a slab, but the majority of it was crawl space.
So just to remind you all, the FEMA program pays for the house on the right.
Yeah, they did not.
That is homeowner contribution on the left to make it.
The siding all underneath, and then the upgraded steps the homeowner did after we elevated.
I just want to
Yes.
clarify, FEMA does not pay for pretty.
But
It pays
that's
for-
an important distinction, though, because under the old FEMA process, if you wanted to add a different kind of a door or something like that, you had to go through all that, so that's not part of the
So
VDIM.
what we've done, because we wanted to streamline this and make this much easier, we do not allow any extra work while the elevation is being done, because people ended up getting their certificate of occupancies tied up because they were adding a bathroom while we were lifting it, and it caused a lot of problems. So they can do anything. He did all of that beautiful work after they finished the project. So the FEMA money pays for it to go up and back down on the concrete block. We finish out, we check the box for the elevation certificate, and then they can go ahead and do their special driveway, their stairway, all of that stuff. The contractor has been good with working with the homeowners, knowing that there's going to be future work, so that is adjusted in the invoice. That's the great thing about the homeowner and the contractor working together, and us just being the administrators of the grant funding.
One other question, what is the average age of the houses we've been doing these for?
Most of them were built in the late 1960s. All of them are going to be pre-firm, pre-1978, so.
And they're all in a hazard zone currently,
Yes.
or they're just repetitive loss?
They have to be in a special flood hazard zone.
Okay, John, then Aaron.
I assume that after this done, they are locked into paying flood insurance
Yes.
forever.
So after the project is complete, they do have to sign a deed restriction, and it does require flood insurance for the life of the property. Flood vents can have to remain open and unobstructed, and that they can only use the underside for storage and parking.
As part of the CRS program, we joined all this, that requires some kind of insurance ourselves on public buildings that are in certain zones and all that. I hope we could get a report on just how many fall in that zone and what we're having to pay. But on this vacant land that we acquire, is there a premium we have to pay on that as well?
No,
That
sir.
Open space, good, I'm not sure I wouldn't be surprised they didn't say yes. I'm just trying to make sure. And it would be nice to know that good example that you have there, that's like a poster child. But it would be nice to know as we get these done for these other homes, because they're a diversity of neighborhoods, you're gonna get a diversity of savings. But to me, the best advertising is signs like that. You know, whatever it is, but different homes give you different feel. But, you know, there are people today in Prince Sam Plaza that aren't taking it because their insurance would be $3,000 a year on the price of their home.
And we had hoped to have, the process for the AW 501, which readjusts your insurance, takes a bit to go through all of the steps. So, but absolutely, that is one table that we wanna have and plaster everywhere we can.
That's a good news story right there. That is a very good news story.
Aaron, then Jim.
Say, when we purchase the vacant lands, I know you said we can't have structures on top of the land, but are there ways that we can be innovative with the surfaces, far as permeable surfaces, that we can help mitigate flooding in those areas?
There are different things you can do with a property. It can be passive recreation on properties, and there are surfaces that you can put on there that they don't consider structures. The main restriction is it can't have a structure on it. FEMA also considers gazebos and picnic structures as structures, so to the extent that if we incorporate it into a park, it possibly could have some play fields on it, or some other drainage support features, but it could not have a structure on it.
It can be used for flood storage. You can dig a big hole or a big ditch in it.
What about gardens or?
Yes,
Sure.
as long as it's not a building.
Yep.
I just like for when we think about that, innovative ways we can retain some of that water.
Yeah, we'd rather not see,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Jim.
So, can you get back, so the picture on the left or the right, really, that garage is where it was elevated, correct?
The one over on the,
On the left, the blue one.
okay, the garage was actually, the garage was where it was. The rest of that is crawl space, and they've just put siding along it.
So the question I have is, even on the one on the right, you end up having enough headroom in there that could be livable space. What is obviously, I'm sure their rules are, you can't make it livable space, but do we enforce that, or do?
So we don't enforce that. If we, FEMA can come through here anytime, VDEM can do the same. So if we had an event, it's one thing that's actually on FEMA's lists. When they come through, if they're doing damage assessment, they may take a cruise by these houses, and it would require the homeowner to pay every dime back if they've,
I hope that's in big bold letters.
It is.
It is, but-
It is. We tell them many, many, many times.
Uncle Sam will collect.
And it's something, I mean, obviously, as the projects are going on, we keep an eye out for that to remind them. When Kim works with them on their deed restrictions, we remind them of that as well.
So the uses are, you can use it for storage or garage space or something like that, but just not occupied, livable space, okay.
Can't have a room down there.
And in fact, any of the utilities, water heater or anything like that in that garage have to be elevated as well, so.
They don't typically
Okay, anybody else at this point?
grade, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very good bridge.
Okay, thank you all very much. Great afternoon of discussion.
That was a very good brief.
Yeah, I'll look at it.
I thought.
You know,